If you're watching this, chances are you have noticed that nearly all of the relationships humanity is involved in are wildly out of balance, and that this is an issue we need to address in order to have a future as a species. Now, if we want to rebalance our relationships across the board, we need to first understand the nature of relationship itself. For that, let's take our relationship to a tree as an example. We can see that it is entirely determined by our story about the tree. In other words, the story we tell about the tree is like a lens through which we perceive it and relate to it. There are, of course, a multitude of different stories with which we can relate to the tree, but generally speaking, they come in two distinct flavors. The first goes something like this. A tree is a renewable resource, a blob of wood, waiting to be harvested and processed into useful things like furniture by men. This type of story feels cold and treats the tree like a dead thing. The second goes something like this. A tree is a living, breathing being, fundamentally interconnected with all of life and thus worthy of man's respect and service. This type of story feels warm and treats the tree like a living being. What is not hard to see is that the former story mediates a parasitic relationship, while the other mediates a symbiotic one, which is another way of saying a balanced relationship. Now, since the predicament we find ourselves in is much greater than just the instance of our relationship to trees, we need to somehow identify the root cause of wrong relationship to solve the general case. For this, we need to go one step further and ask ourselves what our relationship to story itself is. Is it something like, a story is an information technology invented by men for the purpose of large-scale coordination? Or might it be something like, a story is a deeply mysterious, sacred being with which we co-create our reality? Let's define this sacred relationship to story as liminality. If you're like me, you probably resonate with the concept of liminality, but might be confused about what exactly that should even mean. Story as being. In order to get more clarity about this, let's go back in time and explore the indigenous roots of our relationship to story. Back then, we exchanged stories by coming together around the campfire, each bringing our unique stories and perspectives. In the spirit of liminality, we served these beings by simply holding space for them to dialectically self-organize into more coherent versions of themselves. For exceptional insights, we would draw symbols in the sand and infuse them with the spirit of the story. Lastly, since each tribe always had a multitude of campfires, there was always a dynamic flow of people traveling in between campfires. This system effectively allowed all members of the tribe to be in direct contact with each other, thus enabling the stories to flow through and shape the collective with minimal resistance. In a meaningful way, this allowed the stories to incarnate in the collective as a social organism. Much in the same way as the story of, say, a cat incarnates in and as a biological organism. The only problem with that system was that traveling between physical campfires only can get you so far. At some point, the number of, and thus distance between campfires would be too great, which inescapably led to a siloing effect, which in turn translated into the well-known cleaving phenomena of tribes around the Dunbar number of 150 to 500 people. But throughout the millennia, some tribes started innovating on top of our ability to create symbols. The first major step was the abstraction of symbols into symbol systems, like literacy and hieroglyphs, which allowed for non-contextual transmission of stories. In other words, from now on people could read a text without needing to encounter the author. The second major jump consisted of the further innovation of long-distance communication capacity, which, for better or worse, allowed these non-contextual stories to be distributed non-locally by broadcast. Using these technological capacities, a new system for maintaining coherence within the tribe emerged. One where a small elite would distribute stories in a centralized manner to the masses. This constituted the birth of what we might call the social machine. Since this would allow for much greater numbers of people to coordinate and subsequently outcompete other tribes in rivalrous conflicts, it didn't take long for this system to completely dominate our planet. If we take a closer look at it, however, we can see that while the size of the tribe is now much greater, its interconnectedness has radically decreased. The social machine is much bigger than any social organism, but also much shallower. Notice as well our implicit parasitic relationship with stories. The way they are used in this context like an information technology for large-scale coordination, eerily similar to computer code programming drones. For the last 100 years or so, the system was what you might call successful in a very limited sense of the word, meaning it was able to maintain itself. But with the increasing democratization of the broadcast capacity, reaching its climax with the introduction of the internet, this system is deteriorating in a multipolar narrative warfare for attention and influence, which is basically the predicament we find ourselves in today. A mass hypnosis causing a mass psychosis. In the face of our godlike destructive capacity, this becomes an existential threat. So it is clear that in order to have a future as a species, we need to discover a way of relating to stories that has one. A system that integrates the wisdom of the old and the power of the new. Project Liminality is the search for this new system. To search for clues, let's revisit our indigenous roots. Let's define our dynamic relationship to story as the logos. We can see that it consists of three distinct, inseparable and non-interchangeable modalities. The first being our ability to draw symbols in the sand to represent stories. The second being the conversation around the campfire itself. And the last one consisting of the dynamic flow between campfires. So who talks to whom about what? In a sense, this is given by the dynamic interplay of the other two modalities. Sticking with the lingo, let's call the first one monologos, the second one dialogos, and their dynamic interplay interlogos. Now let us observe how the social machine has upgraded these capacities. First, the capacity of the monologos has been increased significantly, for better or worse, with the broadcast modality that is now able to transfer all sorts of digital multimedia content like books, games, audio, video, etc., which, although highly complex, are all in essence monologos. Next, the dialogos has been transformed by lifting the limitation of locality. Now people are able to talk to anybody anywhere through a screen in real time, instead of only people in their local community. Thinking about the increase in capacity afforded by going from the Dunbar number to billions of possible conversation partners, and the combinatorics of the situation is simply mind-boggling. The technological enhancement of these two modalities has, for better or worse, opened up a completely new landscape of possible interlogos protocols. But most of them are either dystopic or catastrophic, among them social media. So we can further narrow down the search of project liminality by saying, to find a system that has a future, we must find the interlogos that has one. How might this interlogos look like? To find clues, let's again look at how it worked in the ancient interlogos. The decision which campfire to join was mediated by two factors. First, by the social connections with those present at the campfire. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, by the stories present at those campfires and the curiosity they naturally did or didn't invoke in the travelers. Notice that in the context of the ancient interlogos, this was all constrained by locality. So people had to get up and walk from location A to location B, covering a physical distance. But remember that we now have the capacity to transcend locality. And herein lies the magic trick. Using that non-local property, we can, instead of letting the story steer the flow from one place to another, turn the story itself into a place. This is our new interlogos. To implement this, we define a software object that represents the story, which we call a monologos node. Think of it as a portal to that story place. So in order to visit that place, you simply hold the monologos node in what we might call your liminal wallet. This can be thought of as a digital twin of the stories you hold in your interior. So how do you obtain such a node? There are two ways for doing so. The first and easiest way is to create one yourself. So if there's an inspiring story inside of you, you can create or find an image that represents it well. Then you simply drag and drop it onto your wallet, which will create a node with that motif. You can of course add any sort of metadata like links, videos, etc. to this node. Given by the interlogos, you start out alone in this new story place. So how do you invite others to join you? Well, by sharing the story with them. Just like we used to draw symbols in the sand to do this, you now put the monologos node on the digital sand in the dialogos. This way, your dialogos partner receives it in their wallet and thus joins you in that non-local place. And now comes the trippy part. If we take a look at how these non-local places interrelate, we can see that each story holds space for a number of people or a memetic tribe. And each member of that tribe holds space for a number of stories, which in turn holds space for other memetic tribes. So what emerges is a holographically interconnected fractal-like space, which means you can navigate to any part by zooming into any other part. Let's call this space liminal space. With this vocabulary, we can see that project liminality can be thought of as a digital interface from physical space into liminal space, from the local to the non-local, from the biosphere into the noosphere. This interface consists of two types of nodes, the monologos and the dialogos node. The first represents a story in monologos form, the other represents a dialogos partner. All the monologos and dialogos nodes you hold will then self-organize through their interlogos relations into a unique network we might call the liminal web. Navigating your liminal web is done by starting at some monologos node, which will show you all your social contexts that are in that space. Selecting one of them will show you all the monologos nodes that you both have in common, in other words, your shared vocabulary. If you find a monologos node that motivates you to discuss it with others, you can initiate a dialogos with any of the people in that place. The interface of the dialogos has three main areas: your liminal wallet, a video chat, and the digital sand. By sharing nodes when they come up during your conversation, you expand each other's horizon and thus liminal web. So this enables a powerful peer-to-peer education system. There is a special moment in education though, when someone shares a story with you that you realize fits perfectly with some other story you already hold, and they both integrate into a higher order perspective. If that happens during a dialogos, you can combine the two or more monologos nodes into a new monologos node that transcends but includes all the input nodes with an added explanation of how these pieces fit together. The most natural way to create the explanation is to record a short clip of explaining it to your dialogos partner. If that happens, it activates what we can call the coherence beacon, which broadcasts the higher order node to all your friends holding either of the input nodes. Those who don't resonate with that synthesis will simply reject the higher order node and the signal will stop. But those who resonate with it will add it into their liminal wallet and thus extend the beacon to all of their friends. So in effect, this creates a social resonance filter that allows for truly meritocratic reach and thus solves the virality problem. But in order to grasp what's really going on here, the way you have to think about this is that a member of a memetic tribe discovers some more beautiful and coherent place, and in turn invites his fellow tribe members living in either of these smaller story places to join him in this bigger place in which they all fit in together. So the users of that system become something like memetic nomads. This means intra-tribe coherence is simultaneously serving inter-tribe coherence, which solves the need for Gerardian scapegoating. If we now consider the recursive application of this process, we can see that all these stories and hence memetic tribes will self-organize into a conveyor belt, moving towards higher and higher coherence and syntropy. Let's call this syntropic flow liminal flow. And where is this liminal flow flowing towards? Towards collective intelligence. Towards humanity becoming an authentic superorganism that creates the more beautiful world our heart knows is possible.